Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Princeton Public Library. My name is Janie Herman, and I am the manager of adult programming. It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to the library tonight for our author event. First, just a few quick housekeeping notes. Please note this room is equipped with a hearing loop that pairs with T-coil technology. If you need hearing assistance and do not have T-coil hearing aids, just let me know and we can get you a pair of hearing headphones for your use. We kindly ask you to silence your electronic devices and hold your questions, as there will be a chance for audience question and answer at the end of the presentation. Finally, the library would like to extend our deepest thanks to Labyrinth Books of Princeton tonight for being not only our co-hosts and partners for this event, but many others, and for being our booksellers, and also to Princeton Lewis Center for the Arts and to the Princeton Humanities Council for all of their sponsorship and support of tonight's event. We're so fortunate to live in a community that supports its authors and readings like this. So tonight we are welcoming Aleksandar Hemon to the library to discuss his recently released novel, The World and All That It Holds. This is a breathtaking novel that spans decades and continents, and it truly cements his status as one of the boldest voices in fiction. Esther Schor will be joining us, tonight's moderator. I'm going to keep their introductions very brief so that we can dive right into what I'm sure is going to be a really fascinating discussion. So Esther Schor is the John F. Sherard University professor at Princeton University. She is a scholar, biographer, poet, and essayist. Her 2006 biography, Emma Lazarus, won the National Jewish Book Award. Her most recent book is Bridge of Words, Esperanto and the Dream of a Universal Language. And she is currently writing a biography of the philosopher Horace M. Cowan. And then Aleksandar Hemon is the author of The Lazarus Project, which was a finalist for the 2008 National Book Award and the National Books Critics Circle Award. The memoir, My Parents, An Introduction, This Does Not Belong to You, and also 3 other books of short stories, which include The Question of Bruno, Nowhere Man, and which is also a finalist for the National Books Critics Circle Award, and Love and Obstacles. He teaches here at Princeton University's Lewis Center for the Arts. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome our guest for the night. Thank you.
Sorry, and I agree that I should read a little. And if you don't like it, you can leave. No, you like it. The book starts on June 28, 1914 in Sarajevo, my hometown. Some of you might know that it was the day that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand decided to visit, or he came to Sarajevo, and it did not turn out well for him or the empire he was representing. My main character, Rafael Pinto, works at an apothec, a pharmacy, and just before the Archduke comes down the street, a handsome Rittmeister walks in, and they have a bit of a flirting, the two of them. And when the Rittmeister walks out, Pinto follows him. Still, returning to the ongoing world was a magnificent thing to do. This splendid rolling forward into the future in obeisance to his heart and desire away from, or deeper into, his own life, into a brilliant reticulation of unknown outcomes toward Kaspar. He named him Kaspar for some reason. To the place my heart must learn to love, there my feet take me. He could see the hackle of the helmet passing over the crowd. Kaspar was very tall, and he stopped at the corner. If he could find a pathway to him, he could say, Herr Rittmeister, it gives me enormous pleasure to inform you that the royal banner is presently proudly fluttering above the door of Apothec Pinto. And if you would like me to show our humble city and its chashia, just say a word and I am yours. Or I could make you a cup of Boston coffee in the back of my apothec, where it is quiet and no one would bother us. Just say a word. A clamor emerged from the crowd that suggested that something was unfolding, but Peter just kept pushing deeper into it until he was forced to stop. There were 2 men now between him and the Rittmeister, at least one of them reeking of wood smoke. There was an odd, mangy dog there too, pushing its way among people as if on a mission. The Rittmeister stuck out in the crowd with his gorgeous uniform lit up from inside by his heroic beauty. Pinto wanted him to turn around, see him in his wake, see him carried forth by desire. From behind, Pinto perceived the shining skin on Kaspar's shaven cheek and the point of his left mustache marking the spot where the dimple would be, and the straight horizontal hairline at the top of his neck. He envisioned two moves, parting the men, addressing the Rittmeister, that would get him close enough to inhale his rose scent. Instead, he inhaled the rancid smoke and sweat reek of the men before him. One of them was clearly an Adeptus, overgrown hair sprouting from under his filthy loose collar. The dog must have been his. Of the other one's shoulder, an accordion hung like a dead animal, one key missing on the keyboard. A car as big as a locomotive turned sharply from the Appelke and halted right before the Rittmeister, and Pinto instantly identified on the back seat the real Archduke, a helmet with peacock feathers over a gold collar with 3 silver stars, and the Duchess in a dress so white it might have been fashioned from God's garment itself, an even whiter hat with a veil, a bouquet of blue and white and yellow flowers in her arms. History recorded that it was a gift from a Muslim girl, which for some reason brings tears to my eyes. It appeared to him that Her Majesty smiled at Kaspar through the veil as though recognizing him, while he bowed his head to her, and again Pinto's heart raced ahead, and he had to take a deep breath lest he faint. To the right of Pinto, a short young man, his hair also unkempt, a thin, strained mustache above his lip, his eyes sickly, pulled out a pistol. For a moment, no one could do anything nor move. Even the dog stared at him in bafflement, while all of the reality hinged on that incongruous detail of the barrel pointed directly at their Imperial Highnesses. The Rittmeister's face tightened in stupefaction, the whole of it. The eyebrows and the mouth and the eyes somehow constricted and became bigger at the same time. The Adeptus reached for the young man's gun, tiny tufts of hair on his fingers between his knuckles, and would have grabbed it if the other man hadn't bumped him aside with his accordion, whereupon the shots rang, louder than a cannon salvo, and then the world exploded. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah, that's great. And you're on too?
We are on.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you about your book. I read it recently and I immediately wrote to Sasha to say thank you for this book. I thought it was just a beautiful, magnificent book, and it's an immensity. I mean, it doesn't look like one, but it is one. The time span is 1914 to 1940. The itinerary moves from Sarajevo to Shanghai and on to Jerusalem. And we'll talk about space and mapping a little later. It holds many genres, many kinds of stories. It's an historical novel, a love story, a war story, a spy story, a ghost story, an epic of return, and a story about parent and child. So I just want to ask how the story took hold of you. I mean, what was the germ? Was it a voice, a character, a scene?
Well, it took me more than 12 years to write it. I sold it on proposal for some reason to my British publisher in 2010 and turned in a manuscript last year. So, but I do not remember the inception point or the time of the inception. I know that it's related to a book I read. I randomly read historical books and books about spies. And I read a book by Frederick Bailey, who was a famous British spy who operated in the 20s, called The Mission to Tashkent. He was part of the Great Game, the rivalry between the Russian and the British Empire. So when the revolution started, they sent him across the mountains from the British Raj to see what's happening in Central Asia, Tashkent. By the time he got there, the Bolsheviks took over. It was complete chaos, right? A lot of Bolsheviks were, in fact, former prisoners of war. And so pretty much as soon as he arrived, they started looking for him to execute him as a British spy. Anyway, adventures ensued. At some point, he ran into a guy who was working for the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, right? Who was from Sarajevo. His name was Mandic, who told him, listen, I know who you are. Let's work together, because Mandic didn't care about any of that ideology, Bolsheviks, and all he wanted to do was get back home to Sarajevo.
Yeah.
And so they worked out a plan to get out. In fact, Mandić hired him to work for the Cheka to look for himself. And the way they got out of Tashkent is that Mandić spread a rumor that Bailey was down the road in Bukhara, just 100 miles away from Tashkent, and that there Bukhara was controlled by an emir who was anti-Bolshevik and a potentate and, killing people who were suspicious. And he spread a rumor that Bailey was talking to emir and was trying to talk him into attacking the Bolsheviks. So then Mandić volunteered himself and Bailey to go to Bukhara to kill Bailey. And so they got the papers and they got this is a very brief version, it goes on for some chapters. But anyway, I like this idea of someone whose sole ideology is getting back home in the middle of all that, is the great cave, the revolution, the whole thing. And I could totally identify with that. And so I started thinking about it, started plotting that, and that's in the book, it's kind of in the center, and started thinking, imagining how I had to get them there, which means they had to be, prisoners of war, and then I tracked backwards as it were to Sarajevo, and then Pinto emerged in the proposal, which I read exactly once since I turned it in 2010. They were friends, and then at some point I decided they should be lovers.
So let's talk about places. We began in Pinto, Sarajevo. And Pinto is an apothecary. I come from a line of druggists, so that was very real to me. He thinks of it as a modern place. He says the Archduke should know that we live pretty well here, and it's the beginning of a century, and it's a sophisticated place. And with this world historical event, he's pulled eastward. To Galicia, to Turkestan, etc. And I wanted to ask you about writing about the desert. Somehow, to me, that's the opposite pole of this sophisticated city, is this brutal desert that they're in. How did you discover this desert, and how did you?
Well, it's hard to miss. It's pretty big, but it's. A lot of writing. When writing a novel, is really trying to get people from point A to point B, both metaphorically. And my people moved to space, trying to get them from Sarajevo to Shanghai. And so, the question is how they would get there. There are no planes, there are no trains. The world is continuously falling apart. And so one of the way was Mongolia, which was kind of a roundabout way. So at some point, Pinto had to cross the desert, right? But, I spent an hour in the desert taking selfies once, but other than that, I know nothing about it. But that's why we have books. One of the decisions I made early in thinking about this book is I didn't want to travel to research. I had spent some time in Shanghai in 2000 or so, and also in what is now Western Ukraine, Galicia. So but there was a time when I considered going to, Uzbekistan. I reached it, I think, with Tashkent and Bukhara and Samarkand, where Tamerlane is buried, and they have beautiful architecture. But somehow, it wasn't that I didn't want to go because it was too hard. It was rather that I wanted to imagine it. I wanted to start from scratch. And so I read books about flora and fauna in Central Asia, and books about trench warfare, and books about POW camps run by Russians. And I had read a lot of books at Hochschild, of books of Shanghai before 1949, and the historical layout there. And then I read books about desert, including the Taklamakan desert. And so to write a novel, it's relatively easy to get a general outline of historical events, where the battles were, what happened in 1932 in Shanghai, but then the details is what matters, right? So how did they, smoke opium there, right? Of course, there were opium dens, but what exactly was the technology and the protocols of smoking opium? What happens in a teba, a sandstorm, right? What was the organization? I spent a lot of time looking at uniforms at some point of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and different units and different, ranks and all this. And this is the kind of thing that no one would know. Maybe actually in Princeton, people would know. Let me retract it, but outside of a place like this, No one really knows what a Rittmeister uniform was like in 1914. But it is this kind, it's on the one hand, it's my compulsion. On the other hand, I have to imagine it to the smallest detail for it to work as a world.
Well, let's talk about Pinto, who is the sort of central consciousness of the book. He's a Sephardic Jew from Sarajevo. And you've written about Jewish characters before, but not in such depth. And I wondered what his Sephardic Jewish identity allowed you to explore.
Well, the first thing, he's a native Sarajevo, and his family had lived in Sarajevo for generations, and also he's multilingual. That was really the main thing for me, because his native language would be Ladino, which in Sarajevo was called Spanish. He would speak Bosnian, and then because he's a Viennese student, he also speaks German. And then as he progresses or regresses from Sarajevo to Shanghai, he picks up languages along the way. But I wanted him to be at home in Sarajevo and long for it. And I wanted him to understand other people in Bosnia, because it's a complex place. So it was never confined just to the Jewish culture. I mean, no Jewish community was really confined just to that, really, because it's a diasporic situation. And so he would know things. But primarily it was so that he could be multilingual. This is what it was an early decision, or one of the sources of the whole project. I wanted to construct a multilingual mind and then move it to the world.
You have a beautiful passage where you talk about Pinto and his daughter, and you say that there was a language that she and Pinto used, a mixture of Bosnian and Spanish and German, and many words they picked up along the way from Tajik and Kyrgyz and Uyghur, and nameless languages and dialects, and it's a private language between them. So there's something very intimate about this. And yet, when you read the novel, there are a lot of sentences that are not in English. They're in German, they're in Ladino, they're in Bosnian, they're in Roman script, but there they are, and they're not translated. So I wanted to ask you about that choice. Did anyone ever urge you?
Yeah, my editor is here, so he confirmed that he did not urge me, nor would I have reacted to that. But I think not only is Pinto multilingual, but the situation like his linguistic situation allows for what is known as a macaronic language. And so it's the kind of thing I have to explain in a lot of places, but maybe not here, but I'll do it anyway. Macaronic language is a use of language where the words and phrases from different languages are used in the same sentence or in the same discourse. Mm-hmm. It is common in migratory or immigrant population and it tends to be intimate because you don't have to translate things. So I know just about everyone in my family is an immigrant somewhere. And so everyone mixes languages, because you cannot think of the word in English for that thing over there, so use a Bosnian word, or the other way around. You cannot think of the Bosnian word for some complicated English language, concept, and so you use the English word. And in fact, it's not dependent on education or anything like that. In fact, more educated people are more comfortable with that. And so this macaronic language allows for creation of new languages. It is my, linguistic theory is that all languages, other than those who were geographically isolated, were at some point macaronic. English in the 12th century was Anglo-Saxon plus Norman. It was macaronic, right? And this happens all the time, everywhere. In American English is also macaronic. I used to teach English second language, and mainly to Russian-speaking students, and I would start with a map of the world with all the words from other languages that came into English. I read sushi or pogrom, or I don't know, cachet. And so this is how languages work. And so I wanted Pinto to change and develop a language as he moves through space. And in the end, and I could not convey this because it really is incomprehensible, he develops a language that only he and Rafael speak. And it's a language that's deeply rooted in experience, right? It refers, its referential domain is the experience. What have they gone through? Yeah. Because each of the Uyghur Kyrgyz words or Tajik words that I might use could be placed into a particular landscape at a particular time.
I mean, it's also the porousness of consciousness, and the map is internal. You know, all of these places they've been have left a mark in them.
Absolutely, and so that the experience changes their consciousness, including their linguistic consciousness. And for that reason, I mean, I knew there was, some risk involved, and I knew that some people would object because, what? There are languages other than English, we don't like that. Why can't they just speak English like everyone else in the world? And so, but I took a risk, and there were certain phrases that I thought people can figure out what this means if they are really, put a little effort into it. And some of them become acquire meaning by way of passing through the book.
Yeah.
Like Labyrinth, which I can't even remember where I found it. So it comes from Ladino, which could be translated as the great unknown, the great obscurity, the great darkness.
The great darkness, yeah. And some are almost like leitmotifs, and they recur. Can I ask you to read a passage about his multilingualism? A passage about
Yes.
the words stork, beginning on 39.
So, and this is also in the book. Pinto is in the trenches of Galicia just before the Brusillo offensive is to start, but it's relatively peaceful, so he's reflecting and remembers the time in Sarajevo when he would walk to the apotheke on the way to work. Walking to the apotheke, his mind infested with all the languages. Pinto would on different days recall a different name for the stork, which was thus always the same and then also not. Sometimes it was Hasida, often Roda, but it would be Lelek in his father tongue after he'd recall how Signor Padre, his father, had used to dress him down for not studying the Torah, for caring more about his attire and cigarette than the word of God, for being rude to customers by not looking up from his Austrian books while they were trying to talk to him, for disrespecting the elders and their wisdom, for daring to be so different from everything his padre had imagined and hoped for. Cali vivere alla moda, he railed. Sometimes Rafa couldn't even understand what Padre was saying, his anger relegating his vocabulary to the earliest centuries where fulminant prophets and absolute prohibitions reigned. On such days, the Lelek would glare at him from its perch as if it had flown from 15th century España in order to judge him in Sarajevo. There had been a time before the war when he'd wanted to write a poem about the stork, something perhaps that would have echoed Baudelaire, whom he had read in German, but he'd aborted his attempt after realizing that the only proper way to do it would be to deploy all the words for the stork he possessed, and maybe even some he didn't. Hasida, Roda, Lelek, stork, maybe even the storch, maybe even the French word, whatever it was. Once upon a time, everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. Now there were a lot of disparate words for each of the things the Holy One created. And it was because the narrator had asked stupid questions and had not kept their faces close to the ground. Who was it that made a house for birds? Who fed them? Who taught the baby storks to open their beaks for a frog? Who singled out the poor weasel? Who taught man to open his mouth and speak? Who put the chatter of voices into Pinto's head and everywhere outside it? And why do the voices and the words never stop? You cannot fathom my rules.
Thank you. Gorgeous passage, all the words for stork, and it's the same and it isn't. I think there's another element of Pinto's Jewishness that comes out in the passage you just read, which is that he's suffused with certain ideas from his study of Torah and Talmud, and you cannot fathom my rules, the story of Babel. And I wonder if you could talk about that a bit. At the beginning of the novel, that he talks about the Holy One. That is the first few words of the novel, the Holy One. And he also talks about the Yetzer Hara, the impulse to do evil. But it's so much more than a battle between the bad impulse and holiness. I mean, talk to us about the Holy One and what he does and doesn't do.
Pinto has this continuous argument with the Holy One,
Yeah.
right? Who is, of course, he was raised in the culture that organized around the centrality of the Holy One, but he's an agnostic about that, can't quite summon the belief, and certainly the belief that, the Holy One would take care of him. And so I read, of course, the Torah and the Talmud and the Midrash, and wrote things down. And I can't source them back now because I didn't keep the references. So at some point, it all became Pinto's consciousness, right? And so unto itself. And I can't remember what is imported into his consciousness everywhere, what I came up with, or he came up with once he started, making decisions for me, as it were. He's in the book, and this is not a sales pitch. It's, when I was describing to my agent this, the idea of the book, what I would put into this proposal, right? And I would describe, so, in Galicia, in Sarajevo, there's the assassination, then in Galicia, there's the Brusilov offensive, and then the prisoners of war camp. And after each of those instances, and then bad things happen. I would make this move with my hands, like the rolling forward of bad things. So, because in the contract, you have to put a provisional name of the book, right? And I didn't have this name in my British contract. The book is called Bad Things Happen. My proposal was guaranteed low sales, but my agent wisely said no. You out of your mind. But in any case, the point is that they, from Sarajevo to Shanghai, they pass in a space in which the old order, if it existed at all, is either falling apart and the new order is just more chaos. At no point do they pass through anything that would resemble, a functioning society, or let alone a nation state. And so it's it's not quite post-apocalyptic. It's pre-apocalyptic and apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic. But it also allows for, it is obviously morality and ethics work different in such situations. So the Holy One, with whom Pinto continuously argues, is also still some kind of moral referential point, right? Because one cannot live without ethics or morality of some kind, whatever it is. And so this conversation, which is always an argument, at the same time, it's not that it provides comfort, but it is a feature of Pinto's consciousness that he hears voices in his head. He imagines Osman's voice, his lover's voice, constantly, and remembers what his father or mother told him at various times, and remembers the songs. And one of those voices, as it were, is the voice of the Holy One, the ultimate authority, who's both oppressive by way of his father, Pinto's father, but also provides some kind of moral order, even if it's totally crumbling repeatedly, right? Because the worlds are falling apart, they're being reconstituted as chaos again, and they're falling apart and they're being reconstituted as a different order of chaos. It's very cheerful.
A passage in the desert when there's this terrible sandstorm, and you write, if God had been there, God would have been hiding from the sandstorm also. And there's something vulnerable about the Holy One. Things happen behind his back. And it leads me to ask you about La Grande Obscuridad, the great obscurity. I mean, sometimes it looks like the Holy One can see into it. Sometimes it looks like it's everything the Holy One isn't. It does a lot of work for you in the book.
It does. I mean, it doesn't always mean the same thing. I mean, ideally, it creates this aura of meaning around itself, right? Because the plot or the structure as it is, right? What that necessitates is that at no point do Pinto or anyone in the book know what's going to happen next. Which means that, the next horizon is just the next point of survival, if they're lucky. Which means that everything beyond that is unknown, La Grande Obscuridad. And then the logic of it all, right? That's the great comfort of God, and all Pinto thinks about it too, is that you might feel that you're never alone and someone's taking care of it, and this whole thing, you don't understand what's going on, and sort of the death is raining upon your head, that somehow it could all make sense, right? And if you have figured out now, I'm an atheist, so that to me doesn't make much sense. But at the same time, I can imagine the need to make sense of it, to be present in the world that has, or feel a need for some structure and meaning and organization to the world. And so Pinto never succumbs, he never submits himself to the power of God consciously. But at the same time, there's nothing else he could do but continue this argument. And that God then becomes kind of an intimate, a kind of a traveling partner to some extent, right? He talks to, and it is also, it's not quite contrast, but there's a certain amount of symmetry because the other voice he repeatedly hears is the voice of his lover, Osman, with whom he presumably commits sin and with whom he has an entirely different relationship, who is present not conceptually, but by way of love.
And this makes me want to ask you about opium, which is a kind of arc over the whole book. We begin by watching him take some laudanum, and we watch later as he takes opium, and it's a very different experience. And just wonder if you could talk about what that is for Pinto.
Well, I've never tried opium. Just it's because it's hard to find, among other reasons. But it's now the opioids, but opium in the olden days was the sort of ritualistic aspect was important. It was also common. It was not uncommon. This was at the time of in 1914, cocaine was prescribable, as was heroin, and all these things. I think it's not that it doesn't have or at least I didn't think about it. It doesn't have a particular symbolic meaning. It's something that he likes, and I think it is an aspect of his poetic, reflective thing. Opium, and what I know about opium is what I read in books, not just about everything else, including a guy who. A memoir who became addicted in the 80s, I think, because he was collecting the gear, which is beautiful. It has a long tradition in Asia, particularly in China. It could be very expensive. It was a sign of privilege for the wealthy Chinese, centuries ago. But then the collectors increased it, and so this guy wrote very interestingly about this obviously fake peace. A sense of balance and stability, and something that stops the flow of time. And I thought that it would be, Pinto has no control over the outcomes in the situation where he finds himself, but then this longing for opium is the only access to peace that he has. And I suppose I just realized this. There was a moment in my life when I dreamt that I was shooting up heroin. I mean, I was sleeping and dreaming this. And what I remember from the dream is this peace. And when I woke up, I realized this is not available to me. And I think this is what Pinto's use of opium came. And not that I've not ever do that, but the point is that I can see the logic of it, that somehow there are moments, there are situations, there are lives, there are moments in history of one's life where that seems like a way to peace. Of course, it's not, right? It's a way to addiction, but for Pinto, this is his motivation.
I think also there's enormous suffering, and the human body comes in for all sorts of atrocity in this book. I mean, it's dismembered, and it's mauled, and it's shot. And whereas the opium at the beginning seems to augment pleasure, by the end, it's really just making life tolerable and bearable, sort of a place to.
Yeah, it's also part of the poetic tradition. Like what Bear was doing opium and the Bohemian poets of Vienna in the early 20th century was not uncommon. In Sarajevo at the time, you could get what they called it opium, but he had access to London, and so he didn't have to hang out in shady places.
So I want to ask you about the historical novel, which is something that I teach at Princeton, and the sort of conventional wisdom about the historical novel is that it is really about the bourgeoisie. It's no longer about high characters. They make flitting appearances. And we seem to be entering that kind of novel at the beginning. We have this sort of middle-class apothecary witnessing the assassination. But most of the novel is about stateless refugees, each with his own story. And that's this plenum of stories. So how do you show world historical meaning from these stateless refugees' experience?
That's a great question. I mean, it's historical as much as I wanted it to last for a century, and so our historians have made arguments, invisible arguments, the 20th century really, not in terms of time measure, but in terms of its historic coherence, started with the assassination of the Archduke and ended with 9/11, right?
Yeah.
So with the assassination of the Archduke, at the moment of the assassination, the world was governed by 4 major empires, maybe 5 if you count the German imperial and Bishop at the time. And within 5 years, by the next chapter, but the 2 chapters later, 3 of those empires are gone, and the 4th one is, ended with Boris Johnson. Like, but that's a different story. So, but it wasn't just the empires ended; it's the whole order, the social order and metaphysical order, the divine right of kings, that lasted for centuries. Just the bottom fell out; it was over, right? The whole thing. And so one can imagine that rupture, and then 9/11 changed the shape of it all. So I wanted really to cover the 20th century. I guess that would make it a historical novel. But also, because of migration and statelessness, and everyone in my family is migratory, and quite a few of us were refugees at some point. What I was interested in this, I was thinking about it and writing about it in various ways. My people moved to space, both in my family and my books, is that I think there's a close connection between migration, moving to space, and narration. And the oldest, as it were, other than poetry, literary form is an epic, right? Where heroes go from one place to another, they run into things to conquer and bad things, problems to solve, whether it's Gilgamesh or the Odyssey or even Don Quixote, and so on. And so I wanted to move them to space, right? And I wanted them to go east, and which means away from this restoration of social order that took place in Europe after World War I, or however it was, whatever happened, there was still some, pretense of social order. And then further west of the United States. So as they're moving away from that, that reduces them to being characters in a basic epic plot, where they have to go through adventures and try to survive, right? And you never know what the next thing is going to be. The Odyssey is much like that. They see Cyclops, and then they, sail a little, and then they see that they get on the islands, right, and they're turned into pigs, and then they get out of that, and then they're sirens, right? It's never boring. And so it is I've grown to believe that perhaps even evolutionarily, our need for narration, and I think narration is closely connected to the way language works, the way we acquire languages as humans individually and as a species, is related to the fact that we at some point started moving to space, going from point A to point B to hunt buffalo over there, and that narrative, and then come back and report where the buffalo might be and tell the story about, Grunty getting killed by one of the buffalo. And so that narrative was a basic unit of information, right? And so it wasn't just for pleasure. And also, in other words, knowledge was passed by way of narrative, a knowledge that was necessitated by encountering new situations. And this was how it was organized. Certainly when literacy was not dominant as a way of transmission of our books, alphabet was not dominant in the society. And so I wanted, in other words, to reduce their situation to kind of basic epic situation. Because they're stateless, they have it's not because they're stateless that they have no agency, but they have no agency in that other than just making local decisions. They cannot influence the outcomes of battles or revolutions, any of that. The only thing they have is this, being inside the narrative, but also generating narratives. And because of that, language becomes the way we're talking about it earlier, right? It becomes this macaronic, multi-faceted language. But they also, at no point do they think that they live in history, because history requires conceptualization that is cultural and societal, right? At this moment in American history, we can all start a sentence like that, whether it's right or wrong. But when shells are raining onto them in the trenches of Galicia, they don't think, that's the Lucille offensive right there, right? The turning point in the war in the East. They just see the shells raining upon them, and they want to stay alive. And so, what I've always thought about, I think that people biologically, evolutionally, feel a need to move toward a space with greater agents, where they would have greater agency. This is the logic of migration, both of refugees and immigrants. And so they don't know where that is, but they are moving in the direction where they think it might be. So that that human life is organized around the need for agency, but the agency is limited by history. It's a very roundabout answer. Agency is limited by the history in which you have no control over the outcomes. You can only decide local things, including who and how to love, and what language and what words to use, and how to be kind or not be kind. And so that I think there's something very basic and fundamental in the structure, the foundation of this book, like people moving to space and trying to stay alive. And looking for language to talk about it and stories that could contain this experience.
One more quotation from the book that I'd like to ask you. You say, "I can confirm from personal experience that we are always late to the history in which we live." Now, maybe you want to say what that personal experience is, but I wonder if Pinto is late to the history in which he lives. He seems to be a witness to history, but is there a sense in which?
Well, that's what I mean, is you're late because you cannot conceptualize it. It's a sequence of events in which you might or might not have agency. When is an example of personal experience. And I was a young journalist in the early 90s in Bosnia, right? And so I had all the facts that I needed to have to understand what was happening. In fact, rationally I could. But for that, you would have to conceptualize a different kind of future, which would also include and feature the undoing of the entire life and the entire system within which you are thinking about this thing, right? And that's, or another way to think about it is that you have to be able to imagine the end of your life as it is. Well, and you have to think about that from inside your life. And there's this impasse, which I think also is part of our, the psychological mechanism that blocks us from thinking about the fact that we're all going to die eventually, right? Because I know I would go crazy if I thought about it all the time. And so, something is happening, you have all the parts of it, but the conceptual framework, this is history in which I have no agency, is too frightening to accept. And so you're always lagging behind. And the fact of the matter is, from my experience in Bosnia and the United States today, those who are preparing those revolutionary, fundamental, murderous transformations are always ahead of us. The rest of us who are sort of trying to negotiate, staying alive.
Well, with
On that note.
we'd like to open it up to your questions. Janie, are you going to?
So if anybody has a question, just raise your hand and I'll run a microphone to you. Questions from the audience? Here we go.
I've always wanted to meet someone from Sarajevo, because all over the world, that name connoted only that the killing of the Archduke and the start of the World War. How do people in Sarajevo feel about that? Is there a resentment that that's all they're known for?
Well, people in Sarajevo also think that they're known for the Olympics, right? But they do. There's so much more, and it's the case in any other place, right? This is the reductiveness of victimhood, right? And because even if people connect Sarajevo with war or Bosnia with war exclusively, it's still far more complicated than that simple connection, sort of, the simple distribution between the killers and the victims. Everyone lived their lives as best they could in those circumstances, and people enjoyed things and laughed and made love and got married and also died, and horrible things happened. So at no point did that life in that city or any city in Ukraine today become less complex, although sort of from afar it sort of reduces the whole situation to, life or death, evil or not, killers and victims. And so, obviously I love Sarajevo, but I also know enough about, one of the things I love, let me put it this way, is its complexity. It's relatively small. It's now 350,000 people. At the peak, maybe it was 450,000. In a very small country, and yet where you look, there's all kinds of complicated and complex things. And I love that. And I think that's the case with just about any place if you know how to look and where to look. And certainly people are all complex, even if they don't know it in various ways. But Sarajevo was kind of self-evidently so, because you can walk from the old town. Sarajevo was in the valley, and the far corner of the valley is where the city started to sort of spread out, right, into the widening field and the river and all that. So when you start in the corner, that's the oldest part of the city, and then you move toward that's going really west, and then you pass through centuries. You go from Old Town, there was started during the Ottoman times, and you cross into the part of town that was ruled by the Austro-Hungarians. It's not perfectly divided, but it should be, but a little mixed. And then you get into socialism, early socialism, then you get into late socialism, and then you get into what we call the transition period. And that's by far, the capitalism, the freedom. And so that's the ugliest part. But you walk through that. To us, it was nothing. I didn't even know. It's like, my heroes, they don't know. They live in history. Really, it's just things happening to you. And then from afar, after you go up and start conceptualizing it, you see the complexity of it. And that complexity is something that I compulsively impose upon the world and language and books and all that. That's the template, really, the complexity of the city and Bosnia.
Are there other questions?
Hello. So follow on to what you just said then. I think that's really interesting about when you're living in a moment, you can't possibly know the importance it has in history. But as a writer, how do you kind of not go to what you know happened in history and just stick with what the character in that moment knew? How do you not impose kind of the future on what you're writing and stay in the moment?
It requires some discipline, including editing, right? And so you have to establish an epistemology that belongs to the character and not to you. I mean, it does to you in the end, obviously, but it's what would they know at that time, right? It is also true that because there's an authorial voice in the book, there's a certain amount of, and I mean, I did it deliberately, of projection on the part of this authorial voice onto the two of them, right? A certain amount of anachronistic judgment, so to say. And that's part of the point. But I think a lot of it is in editing in terms of writing the book. It's also when I read the books, when I read the Bailey book, which was published in the 20s, right? He's still stuck in the time. There's a character in the book that is based on Bailey, and I gave him a lot of memoirs that he wrote all the way to the 70s. And so he's part of the anachronistic layer in the book as such. But in the original, the Bailey book, Frederick Bailey, his nickname was Mad Hatter, Frederick Mad Hatter Bailey. A mission to Tashkent. He's speaking and thinking as a person in the 20s. And at some point I thought I did sort of impose a ceiling to their epistemology, or to my epistemology, and not to go about it, not to know more than that.
Okay. It's keeping me running here.
So as a Sephardi from Balkans and granddaughter of a Khamka soldier that ended up in Galicia at one point, I listened to your book with great curiosity. But I have a question about something that you mentioned about the languages. So when you write your book, in which language do you write in your head?
Well, it depends on the book I write. If I write in English, then it's English. And plus all these other languages, some of which I don't speak. So, but yeah, I don't translate when I write or when I talk. It's easier to write a book in one language and then rewrite it in another language and to translate it from one language to another. I mean, I don't translate my work, I just edit it, someone else translates. But I think in English when I think in English, and I can think in Bosnian when I eat. And there's also often I don't think at all. That's great. We should all try it sometimes. So it is, it's English. I think that to write in a language, it has to be part of the subconscious mind. When one's native language, obviously it becomes part of it's located in the subconsciousness from an early age because you just absorb it. And for some reason or another, in the 90s, the English became at home in my subconsciousness.
I was going to ask, so in reading this book, I mean, I read a lot of books for my position, and as a public librarian, a lot of our books are also, what we call more, popular fiction as opposed to the more literary fiction. And so your book, I felt like with your book, it was an intense read, and I could only read it for smaller bits at a time because I had to sit with what I had just read, and it was like every word was so carefully chosen. So do you feel like the intensity of your own writing, so that can you write in long periods, or do you have to write a little bit? I found I had to read and take a break. So is that the same when you're writing? Because it's very intense.
Well, I mean, it took more than 12 years, but it's also, it wasn't the only thing I was writing, and other things were also intense. I guess it's, I don't know. I mean, it is intense, but I like that intensity. It's like one gets excited I get excited when I write things, start imagining everything that could happen. It also, I don't write, 5 or 8 hours a day necessarily. I've never done that. I usually, when I write that, once I'm done with research and all that, I can write really, really fast. And I can crank out, 2,000 words in a few hours, 2 or 3 hours. And because of that, it wasn't just intensity. I cannot, because I had other things to do, other books to write. Sometimes I would just write intensely 2 or 3 hours or 4 hours of the book, and then I would do something else. But it's not, I understand what you're asking. It does get exhausting, and it's also part of my connection to the book, right? Because we will live through this together, my book and I. And it creates, a bond.
Oh, here's another question. I'll come back to you in a second. What was the state of the room?
Thank you for this conversation and echoing Starry for the book. I just wanted to say that it's also a very great love story. And so many bad things happen, but there's also something very, very good that happens, which is this love between these two men and then between Pinto and the adopted daughter. So could you talk a little bit about what allows him to survive as long as he does, and about the gift of that love and how the relationship in which that stands to his ability to travel on?
Yes. Well, as I was mentioning earlier, the original proposal, they were just friends, and then the whole setup was that they want to go back to Sarajevo, but they just kept moving away from it, and they had to come up with new plots to try to get back, and didn't work. All along, they would be longing for it more and more, and eventually this nostalgia would convert Sarajevo into their own myth. So they were sort of imagining things that had no contact or access to it. It would become this kind of nostalgia as retroactive utopia, so this utopian place, right, which is common among displaced people, and I know it well from my family and friends. But I never had a moment of realization. I can't remember why and how. But in retrospect, I think that the reason that I decided it should be longer is that love is far more dynamic than nostalgia, because it involves human beings and their bodies, and it requires, care that is really biological. As you were, right? Take care of yourself and take care of others, your child or your lover. And there was far more, how would I put it, complex and demanding on the part of characters, which is narratively productive. It also allows still for this longing for Sarajevo by way of longing for each other, right? Because this is where, although Pinto at some point says, let's just not go back, let's just stay here because we have to, and they're living in some small room in Tashkent, and no one knows what's going to happen next. But I think at some point I was talking about this epic structure, right? And so in Gilgamesh and Enkidu, they're just about to be lovers, but they're too nimble to actually make out. And so, but it really is, all of the adventures in going to the other side, to the underworld, is really about the love between, it's really homoerotic. And you can push it to that point. And so there's something about the epic structure that is also a love story, right? The heroic, Odysseus only loves Penelope, who's waiting for 20 years, but he's other than that, he's cavorting with the courts, and even Don Quixote, right? And so I wanted to insert love into that epic structure, see what happens. It would also allow for testing the limits of love, because it's not endless. I mean, that's very nice. I don't think there were many love affairs in Auschwitz, right? There has to be a certain amount of agency that is connected, or love provides a certain amount of agency, and agency is something that is not allowed at all. It's punishable by death in Auschwitz. And so as long as they can make decisions, then those decisions are connected to their love, some kind of love for Rahela, for Osman on the part of Pinto. Then there's this desire to move forward. And this is why he survives. It's not that he says the gumption and the resolve. He just goes from one place to another, trying to stay alive and keep those he loves alive, and then see how far he can get. And this is how we live in many ways.
Okay, and I think we have one last question up front here.
Can you tell us what is your identity? How do you, you're Bosnian, you're Ukrainian, American. Can you tell me more about that? And second is aggression. How do you compare Chicago to Princeton? Your life and work here and there.
Well, yeah, it's much the same. Well, I mean, Chicago is a huge city, and Chicago is the size of Bosnia, really, in terms of population, for instance. So it means that all of these complexities that I like in Bosnia are available in a city like Chicago, which I also like. And Princeton has many advantages, including comfort, but it's not as complex as Chicago, Bosnia, which is an aspect of its, which is an advantage. As for identity, when people asked me back in the day, what are you? And trying to define my position in relation to the war in Bosnia or anything else, I would say I'm complicated. And then my ex-wife at some point told me, kind of accused her, or she said, you only like complicated people, which is true. But I also think that most of the people are, in fact, all of the people are complicated. The question is whether you own it or not, whether you see it as a disadvantage or a set of opportunities and layers to your personality and consciousness and all that. So I'm Bosnian and Ukrainian and American and a writer and many other things. And I think that freedom is being allowed to strive toward greater complexity. What bigotry does is reduces people to a single feature and then dismisses that feature as illegitimizing of the of being of less human value, right? And so, which is why democracy is important and good for us, because there is no perfect democracy, but it's ideally, democracy would allow people to be whoever they want to be in any way they want to be. I had an uncle who would say, and it's a little clunky in English, but in Boston sounds great. Whatever kind of people exist, that's the kind we need, is a very rough translation, right? The more, the merrier, the more diversity, and biologically, I think that's easy. In terms of survival of the species, that's the advantage, right? If you imagine that Trumpists are the way of the evolution, that really it's good news for the frogs. And so I like that complexity. I cherish the complexity. I pursue that in my books and in my head, and that's why I like people. I like complicated.
Okay, I think that's a really good note to end on. I like that saying that you just shared. So thank you so much to both of you for being here tonight with us at the library. What a fascinating conversation. It's a great book. I encourage everyone here who has yet to read it. And for that purpose, we will have a book signing here with Labyrinth Books, and we'll say goodnight to those on the live stream. And if you'd like to come back on Wednesday night, we are doing another event here with Labyrinth Books with Diane Wilson, who's going to be here to talk about her book, The Seed Keeper, another novel, very different in tone and topic, but equally fascinating. So always something happening here at the library. And thank you again to all of our event sponsors for this event.